The morning sun cast a warm golden hue over Ouagadougou as President Ibrahim Traoré stepped out of the presidential palace. Unlike the usual days filled with official meetings and formal routines, this Monday felt different. There was a quiet determination in the young leader's eyes. He had made a decision that would surprise even his closest security staff and change one man's life forever. "Take me to the central prison," he said calmly, adjusting his plain brown shirt. "No announcements, no media, just us." The driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror, startled. "Sir, shouldn't we inform the prison authorities, arrange security?" But Traoré shook his head. "I want to see things as they really are, not the cleaned-up version. Real conditions." The black presidential car rolled through the busy streets of the capital, accompanied by just two unmarked vehicles. Street vendors shouted out their offers, children played in dusty courtyards, and the city moved to its usual rhythm, unaware that their president was on his way to confront a hidden truth inside the country's justice system. 40 minutes later, the convoy arrived at the tall, gray walls of the Ouagadougou Central Correctional Facility. Coils of razor wire glinted at the top of the concrete walls, and the air felt thick with untold stories. The guards at the gate froze as they spotted the presidential vehicle. "Mr. President," one of them stuttered, nervously fumbling with the keys. We didn't know you were coming. That's exactly why I came," Traoré said as he stepped out of the car, opened the gates. Within moments, Warden Pascal Wedra rushed out, sweat dripping down his face despite the cool morning breeze. "Your Excellency, if we had known, we would have prepared everything properly. The facilities, the prisoners," the warden began, but the president cut him off. "I'm not here for arrangements," he said, walking past him. "Take me to the prisoners. That's why I came." Warden Pascal hesitated for a moment, then silently led the way. They walked through a narrow corridor, the air thick with distant echoes, coughing, hushed voices, the clanging of metal doors. The smell was immediate and overwhelming: sweat, damp walls, and the heavy staleness of despair. As they entered the main prison block, an odd silence fell. Moments earlier, the prisoners had been playing cards, lying on thin mattresses, or simply staring at the walls. Now, one by one, they stood up. Their faces showed shock, confusion, and something long buried hope. President Traoré moved among them without a trace of arrogance. He shook hands, asked questions, and listened closely to what the men had to say. His security detail watched in surprise as he gave his full attention to each voice. "How long have you been here?" he asked one middle-aged man. 3 years, Mr. President," the man answered. "Theft charges. Do you have a family, a wife and 2 kids, sir?" "They come when they can afford the travel." Traoré nodded slowly, storing every answer in his mind. Some inmates spoke freely, others cautiously. A few simply cried, overwhelmed by the idea that someone important was finally listening. For more than an hour, the president walked through cramped cells, sat on concrete floors, and shared quiet moments with men the world had left behind. But then, at the far end of the block, in a dim, isolated cell, something caught his attention. A man sat alone in the corner, unmoved by the president's arrival. His head hung low, hands resting in his lap. His beard was untrimmed, clothes worn thin, and his body language radiated defeat. He hadn't stood like the others. He didn't seem surprised, like someone who'd stopped expecting anything from life long ago. Traoré stepped closer and paused at the bars. Slowly, the man looked up. Their eyes met, one carrying the weight of leadership, the other hollowed by years of silence and sorrow. "What's your name?" the president asked, gently. "Emmanuel," came the quiet reply. "How long have you been here?" "Emmanuel, 7 years, sir." The number sank into the room like a stone in still water. 7 years. The president studied Emmanuel's face. There was no anger, no bitterness, only the exhausted grace of someone who had suffered without protest. "What were you accused of?" Emmanuel hesitated, then answered. "They said I stole money from my employer, but I didn't. I worked for him for years. He just needed someone to blame. I was easy to frame." As Emmanuel spoke, his voice began to rise, not in anger, but in clarity. Talking to someone who truly listened seemed to awaken something in him that had long been buried. Traoré didn't interrupt. He listened with the quiet focus of someone who understood what was not being said. He could see it clearly now. This wasn't just a visit. This moment, in a forgotten corner of an overcrowded prison, was about to change two lives, Emmanuel's and his own, because in this broken place, justice had just found its voice. The silence in Emmanuel's cell felt almost sacred, thick, still, and heavy, broken only by the faint sounds of life echoing through the prison. President Traoré stood quietly, eyes fixed on Emmanuel, who continued speaking, his voice slowly gaining strength, as if releasing words that had been locked inside for years. "I didn't have a lawyer," Emmanuel said, his tone steadier. "Now, no one spoke for me when they brought me to court. I stood there alone while my former boss had a team of expensive lawyers by his side." The judge barely even looked at me before saying it. 15 years. A cold anger stirred inside. "The president, tell me about your employer," he asked. "Wrongfully," Emmanuel replied, the name like a wound on his tongue. "He owned a logistics company. I worked there for 8 years, never missed a day. I was honest, always on time. Then one day his nephew needed a job, and just like that, I became expendable." His voice drifted off, but the betrayal still clung to every word. President Traoré turned to the warden standing nervously behind him. "Bring me this man's file," he ordered. "Every document, every piece of evidence, every record from his trial, sir. It might take some time to locate. You have until sunset." The president interrupted, firm. "I want to know who arrested him, who prosecuted the case, who the judge was, and every detail of the investigation. No excuses." As the warden hurried off, Traoré turned back to Emmanuel. "Why didn't you appeal? Surely you had some options." Emmanuel gave a quiet, bitter laugh, not out of anger, but out of exhaustion. "With what money, sir? My wife left within the first year, took the kids and went back to her parents' village. Said she couldn't live with the shame. I didn't have anything left, not for lawyers, not for bribes. No one cared, no one listened." The president stood silently, letting those words settle. This wasn't just about one man's suffering, it was a window into something bigger. A system that crushed the powerless while protecting the well-connected. "Have you had any visitors in all these years?" he asked. "No one," Emmanuel answered quietly. "I wrote letters for the first 2 years. They were never answered. After a while, I stopped trying, learned to live with silence, found what little peace I could in being alone." That evening, President Traoré sat alone at his desk in the Ministry of Justice. Emmanuel's file was open in front of him, pages spread out, evidence highlighted, and notes scrawled in the margins. What he read made his blood boil. The investigation had been careless, the evidence weak, the trial over in under 2 hours, and the judge, Justice Amadou Diabra, had been dismissed 3 years ago for taking bribes. The very man who sentenced Emmanuel to 15 years behind bars had no business wearing the robes of justice. He was a criminal himself. Traoré picked up the phone. "Dufresne, I need you here. Now. Cancel everything within the hour." Justice Minister Dufresne entered the office and found the president pacing, like a storm ready to break. "You asked to see me, sir?" "I went to the central prison today," Traoré said, wasting no time. "I met a man named Emmanuel. He's been locked up for 7 years for a crime he likely never committed." He handed the minister the thick file. "Read it, all of it. Then explain to me how our justice system let this happen." As Dufresne flipped through the documents, his expression darkened. His face went pale. It was all their fabricated evidence, a rushed investigation, a judge with a corrupt history, and a man without a lawyer, voice, or defense. Wrongfully had used his power and money to destroy someone's life, and no one had stopped him. The system hadn't just failed Emmanuel, it had practically welcomed the injustice. This is awful," the justice minister finally admitted, flipping through the damning documents. "But sir, the conviction still stands, legally. We can't what?" The president cut in, his voice rising. "Can't seek justice, can't correct a mistake, can't admit that we stole 7 years from an innocent man." The minister went silent, realizing there was no point trying to argue. President Traoré had made up his mind. Here's what we're going to do, Traoré said firmly. By tomorrow, I want an independent review team formed. I want prosecutors, defense lawyers, and human rights observers, people who won't play games. They'll reinvestigate Emmanuel's case from scratch. And while they're at it, I want a full probe into Laurentger. If he framed Emmanuel, I promise you this isn't the first time. Over the next 48 hours, the review team worked day and night. What they uncovered was worse than anyone expected. Ger's company had accused 5 other employees of theft in the last 10 years. In every case, the accused had been poor, had no lawyers, and were convicted quickly, swept aside by a system that didn't bother asking questions. The patterns were impossible to ignore. And then came the final blow. The evidence in Emmanuel's case had been completely fabricated. His so-called confession, forged. The financial documents used against him, doctored beyond belief. When the team presented their findings, President Traoré felt a storm of emotions, relief that the truth was out, and pure anger that it had taken this long. He was framed, the president said flatly. His life was destroyed for nothing. All because of one man's greed and a justice system that looked the other way. He stood up, his voice resolute. We're not just freeing him. We're making this right, and we're making damn sure it never happens again. The next morning, President Traoré returned to the prison, but this time, he didn't come quietly. With him were government officials, legal experts, and a convoy of news cameras. The country was about to witness something it had never seen before. A sitting president walking into a prison to undo a terrible wrong personally. As the morning sun rose over Ouagadougou, reporters and cameramen trailed behind him through the same corridors he'd walked alone just days earlier. Their footsteps echoed with urgency. Word had already spread through the prison. Something big was about to happen. Emmanuel, however, remained unaware. After 7 years of false hopes and disappointments, he had trained himself not to expect anything. So when he heard footsteps approaching his cell, he barely lifted his head, expecting another routine check. Emmanuel. Came the voice. The same voice that had haunted his mind for 3 days. This time, when he looked up, he saw not just the president but an entire crowd behind him. Cameras, lawyers, officials, and expressions that didn't look like pity, they looked like action. His heartbeat quickened, but after so many years, he still couldn't fully believe what he was seeing. Emmanuel, President Traoré said, his voice calm but firm, echoing through the quiet cell block. I've read your file. You weren't just wrongfully accused, you were betrayed by a system that should have protected you. The prison fell silent. Inmates leaned against their bars, watching history unfold. I'm sorry, the president said, his eyes meeting. Emmanuel's, our nation failed you. Our courts failed you. But today, we begin to make it right. He turned toward the legal team beside him and gave a small nod. Emmanuel, you're going home today. For a moment, Emmanuel didn't move. The words didn't register. Home, after 7 years? The idea of freedom felt unreal, almost like dreaming of flying. Emmanuel's legs trembled as he gripped the cell bars for support. This is real? He whispered, tears sliding down his cheeks. Yes, President Traoré replied gently but firmly. You are a free man. The cell door creaked open one final time, and Emmanuel stepped out into the corridor, his legs shaky, his mind still catching up. Around him, the prison erupted. Inmates clapped, shouted, and cheered, some with tears in their eyes. It wasn't just about Emmanuel's freedom. In that moment, it felt like hope had cracked through the thick walls and spread through everyone locked behind them. Outside, a crowd had already formed. The news of the president's unexpected prison visit and the man he had freed had spread quickly through Ouagadougou. People had gathered to see it with their own eyes. As Emmanuel stepped into the sunlight, he blinked against the brightness. After 7 years under dim prison lights, the sun felt almost too real, too sharp. But the sound of cheering met him there, too louder, fuller. Reporters rushed forward, voices overlapping with questions. How do you feel? What will you do now? Do you hold anger toward those who imprisoned you? Emmanuel stood still for a moment. The noise, the freedom, the faces, all of it pressed in on him at once. Then he spoke softly, honestly. I don't know how to feel, he said. I have no family, no home, no job. But for the first time in 7 years, I have hope. Maybe that's enough for now." President Traoré stepped forward and placed a steady hand on his shoulder. His voice, clear and steady, rose above the crowd. "You are not alone," he said. "Our nation owes you more than it can ever repay. But we will help you rebuild your life." And he meant every word. That very day, President Traoré drove Emmanuel himself to the presidential guest house. No motorcade, no formality, just one man helping another. For Emmanuel, even the smallest things felt surreal. A hot shower, fresh clothes, a soft bed, and a warm meal eaten at a proper table. He was stepping back into a world he thought he'd lost forever. That evening, the two men sat in a quiet sitting room with 2 cups of tea between them. The formal lines between president and citizen had faded. What remained were just 2 human beings speaking honestly for the first time, without barriers. "Tell me," Traoré asked, "before all this, what did you dream of doing? What kind of life did you imagine?" Emmanuel paused, then smiled genuinely. "For the first time in years, I wanted to be a teacher," he said. "I was studying education before I took that job at Ger's company. I love the idea of helping children, giving them the tools to create a better life." "Then that's exactly what you'll do," the president said without hesitation. "We'll help you finish your education, and when you're ready, we'll make sure you have a place in our school system." But Traoré wasn't done yet. A larger vision had started taking shape in President Traoré's mind, while Emmanuel slowly began adjusting to his new life outside prison walls. The president was quietly working on something far more ambitious: a complete, nationwide audit of the prison system. If this could happen to Emmanuel, he told his cabinet, how many others are living the same nightmare? How many innocent people are rotting behind bars while we pat ourselves on the back for law and order? The room fell silent. The idea unsettled many. Some ministers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, worried about the consequences. "What if we uncover hundreds of wrongful convictions?" one of them asked. "What if the public loses faith in the justice system altogether? Then we fix it." Traoré replied, without hesitation, "All of it. No matter how painful, no matter how shameful, no matter how costly. Justice delayed is justice denied, and we've been denying it for too long." Within a week, the president publicly announced the launch of Operation Justice Light, a sweeping national review of all inmates who had served more than 5 years, with special focus on those who were convicted without proper legal defense. This wasn't just about setting the record straight, it was about rebuilding trust in the very system meant to protect the people. Emmanuel wouldn't just benefit from this new vision, he would become its face, and eventually, one of its leaders. His personal journey was evolving into something much bigger, a symbol of transformation. For an entire country, 3 months after his release, Emmanuel stood at the podium of a packed auditorium at the University of Ouagadougou, wearing a crisp, white shirt and a dark jacket. He looked nothing like the man who had once sat quietly in a prison cell, waiting for life to end. But it wasn't just his appearance that had changed, it was his voice, steady and confident, that carried the biggest shift. "I speak to you today not as a victim," he began, his voice cutting through the silence, "but as a witness to what happens when power goes unchecked, and as living proof of what can happen when leadership chooses courage over convenience." In the front row, President Traoré watched with quiet pride. It had been Emmanuel's idea to speak directly to law students, the future of Burkina Faso's justice system. It was his way of turning pain into purpose and warning them not to repeat the mistakes of the past. Operation Justice Light, which many had once feared, was now receiving international recognition. In just 6 months, over 2,000 cases had been reviewed. Of those, 347 prisoners were found to have been either wrongfully convicted or kept beyond their legal sentence. Behind each number was a story: broken homes, stolen years, and dignity erased by a system that had forgotten its role. But perhaps the most explosive findings were about the man who had started it. All Laurentker, investigators uncovered a broader web of corruption involving multiple powerful businessmen who had weaponized the justice system to get rid of employees, rivals, or anyone who stood in their way. Judges had been bribed, evidence had been forged, witnesses silenced. And now, Gur himself sat behind bars in the very same prison where Emmanuel had spent 7 long years. He faced multiple charges: fraud, bribery, conspiracy, and abuse of power. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, especially not Emmanuel. He visited his former employer once, not out of vengeance, but to deliver a message: justice is not revenge. He told Gur through the prison bars, it's the hope that others won't have to suffer like we did. You, in your greed, and me, in my innocence. Even the hardened businessman had been moved to tears. President Traoré had been so moved by their encounter that he appointed Emmanuel as special advisor on prison reform and human rights, a role that had never existed before, but quickly became essential to the government's sweeping transformation efforts. In this new position, Emmanuel traveled across the country, from the largest prison complexes in major cities to remote rural jails that had operated for decades without oversight. He brought not just the authority of his title but the powerful credibility of lived experience. In the northern town of Dori, he uncovered a heartbreaking case: a man who had been forgotten in a cell for 12 years without a trial. In Bobo Dioulasso, he met 3 women imprisoned for so-called economic crimes, which, upon investigation, were revealed to be nothing more than acts of poverty. Each visit deepened Emmanuel's resolve. Each face, each story, reminded him how easily justice could be buried under indifference. But he also knew that freedom wasn't enough. Opening a cell door was only the beginning. Emmanuel began pushing for comprehensive post-release support, job training, mental health counseling, family reunification programs, and legal aid, all designed to help people not just survive, but rebuild their lives. Freedom is not just unlocking a cell door, he told a gathering of international human rights observers. It's giving people the tools to live with dignity and building a system that serves justice, not power. President Traoré fully embraced this vision. Under his leadership, Burkina Faso quickly became a regional model for judicial reform. Legal aid clinics were established in every region. Judges and prosecutors received mandatory retraining, and an independent prison oversight board was formed with Emmanuel appointed as its chair. But real reform came with resistance. Powerful figures who had thrived under the old system began to push back. Some accused the president of being naive. Others claimed Emmanuel was on a revenge mission. But public support only grew stronger, especially as more families were reunited, and long-buried injustices began to surface. Exactly 1 year after his release, Emmanuel returned to Ouagadougou Central Prison not as a prisoner, but as a guest of honor. The facility had undergone a complete transformation. Better living conditions, educational programs, and legal aid centers now filled its halls. But what stood out most was the plaque at the entrance. Freshly mounted and gleaming in the sun: justice delayed is justice denied. Never again. Standing before a crowd of government officials, former prisoners, and tearful families, Emmanuel took a deep breath and reflected on the road that had led him there. It was a journey that had led them all to this moment. A year ago, Emmanuel began. Standing before the crowd, I sat alone in a cell, convinced the world had forgotten me. He paused. I was wrong. The world hadn't forgotten. It simply hadn't been listening. He looked out at the faces gathered: former prisoners, government officials, and families with tears in their eyes. Today, we celebrate more than my freedom. We celebrate a collective promise that every voice will be heard, every case judged fairly, and every person treated with the dignity they deserve. President Traoré took the podium next. His remarks were brief, but powerful. Sometimes, he said, a leader's greatest achievement is knowing when to follow. Emmanuel has taught our nation more about justice than any law book ever could. The work continues, but the foundation is strong. As the ceremony came to a close and the crowd began to drift away, Emmanuel lingered. He stood quietly outside the cell that once held him captive, now transformed into a small library. Sunlight poured through the barred window, casting golden streaks across books on law, human rights, and social reform. These were tools, not just for reflection but for revolution. instruments for future generations to build something better, Emmanuel turned and began walking away from the prison, this time for good. He did not carry bitterness for the years lost. Instead, he carried hope for those whose lives would be spared the injustice he endured. Thanks to the reforms they had fought to bring to life, he had come to understand a truth that would stay with him forever. Justice is not a destination. It is a journey, one that demands vigilance, courage, and a deep commitment to hearing the voices others too easily ignore. As the sun set over Ouagadougou, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and violet, Burkina Faso continued its own journey toward a more just tomorrow.